Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're all enjoying a wonderful summer, and thanks for taking the time to join us today. For those of you I'm meeting for the first time, my name is Lauren Rudolph Hesselton, and I'm delighted to be hosting today's discussion. I am an investment counselor here at Kerr, and I've had the pleasure of being part of the team for the past 13 years. I'm joined today by our CEO, Krista Kerr, and our senior investment counselor, Frank Settino. Frank and Krista will walk us through second quarter market developments, key opportunities and trends shaping the outlook going forward, and we'll touch on several timely topics, including the return of income in bond markets, the rise of Japanese equities, and of course, AI, because it certainly wouldn't be a market webinar in 2026 without talking about AI. And also, I don't know about you, but summer has a way of making us feel a little more optimistic, which happens to be a sentiment that was reflected in the markets last quarter. Of course, today's session will look beyond the returns themselves to examine key developments driving investor sentiment and explore how evolving market trends are shaping the outlook for the months ahead. Please note you can submit questions at any time via the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. We'll do our best to address all questions during the Q&A portion at the end of the session. And if we move on to the next slide, I would love to briefly introduce Kerr Financial to you, as well as our investment philosophy, particularly for those who may be joining us for the first time today. As a discretionary portfolio management firm, we have a fiduciary duty to be responsible stewards of our clients' capital, placing their best interests at the center of every decision. Our approach as a firm to managing portfolios is anchored in three core principles. The first, as you see here, is a disciplined focus on long-term investment objectives. The second is deep diversification across not just asset classes, but geographies, sectors, investment styles, and beyond. We believe diversification is one of the most effective tools for managing risk and enhancing long-term outcomes. By combining investments that respond differently to changing market and economic conditions, we seek to build resilient portfolios that can weather a variety of market environments. And finally, we have strong conviction in our platform of investment solutions, where we select best-in-class investment managers with complementary mandates and styles. And this allows us to create a diversified and robust foundation for our client portfolios. Together, these principles provide the foundation for us to construct portfolios with independence, flexibility, and discipline, while remaining firmly focused on the long-term goals of the families we serve. So moving along, Krista Kerr will be our first speaker today. She is the CEO of Kerr Financial and is responsible for our firm's overall leadership and strategic direction. She is a key member of the investment committee and is the leader of our multifamily office division, which delivers deeply integrated solutions to ultra-high net worth families with a focus on multi-generational wealth stewardship. Krista is a recognized thought leader in Canada's MFO community and is frequently featured in industry publications for her insights and expertise. Krista will be followed by Frank Settino, who leads the firm's investment management division, is the chair of our firm's investment committee, and serves on the senior leadership team. Frank is a 30-year industry veteran, a chartered financial analyst, and he began his career in Canadian equity analysis at a major institution before joining Kerr back in 2015. Frank's deep capital markets expertise and disciplined investment approach continue to be an invaluable asset to our firm and to the families we serve. So with that, let's begin. I'll invite Krista to turn on her video and microphone and take it from here with our first polling question.
Thank you, Lauren, and hello, everybody. As we usually do in these sessions, we are going to start with a polling question. This one's quite a broad or general question, but it'd be interesting to get your insights. And of course, all these things are linked, which we can address after. So our question for you today is, what has surprised you the most about the economy this year? Is it that economic growth has remained resilient? Inflation has remained more elevated than anticipated? Markets have continued to rise, interest rates have stayed higher, or AI investment has remained accelerated? So I'll let you take a moment to answer that, and then we'll talk about sort of how they all link together before we launch into the materials today. Okay. We'll see if it provides us with a solution. So we've got even amongst the two that I thought would be the highest that people would score. So the highest score with 42% of the votes was that economic growth has remained resilient. And then shortly behind that, 37% markets have continued to rise. And then both inflation remaining elevated and interest rates remaining higher at 11%. And nobody's surprised that AI investment has continued to be strong and accelerated. I think it's interesting how all these things link together because, of course, we did anticipate coming into this year that inflation would continue to drop down or decelerate towards targets. But then we've had supply side shocks with geopolitical events that have kept inflation elevated. With inflation being elevated, that has required to have interest rates remain elevated by central banks. So those two things have provided some headwind to economic growth in markets. But at the same time, that AI investment acceleration has really provided a tailwind. And that, along with earnings, have kept economic growth growing, even though it slowed a little bit. And those things are leading to markets continuing to rise. So I think they are all very interrelated. But what we're going to do today is we're going to talk a little bit about what happened in the quarter and then focus on what is supporting markets going forward. What economic factors are we keeping an eye on? What risks are we keeping an eye on? And how we want to manage portfolios in this uncertain environment. Uncertain but positive, as we saw in the second quarter. So if we move to the next slide, there's just a little bit of an illustration on what happened high level in markets during the quarter. So this just shows you when we picked up the quarter at the beginning of April, we had come off of a difficult March with the Middle East conflict. And then in April, people felt there was a de-escalation of that conflict. I guess that, is an uncertain thing from day to day when we see what's happening in the conflict today. But that was the feeling that there was some de-escalation there and some stabilization of that region. And then also we had the AI spending continue and we had earnings remain strong. So all of those things really drove markets up to new highs towards the end of May, beginning of June. And then we had a little bit of a pullback in June, specifically in some of the technology names, but that kind of is a regular occurrence when you have big market rises. So that was sort of what happened. Oh, we need to go the other direction, I think. If we go a little bit further beyond this, we can see what's happened in the market overall. So just to give you a brief overview of the second quarter, as usual, this is a graph that shows you how things have done in the quarter, the year to date, the year, and the 3 and 5 year periods by asset class. So on the far left, we have cash, which you can see has continued to moderate. We had that period where cash was giving pretty high returns, about 4% on your cash holdings if you go back on the average for 3 years. But in the last quarter, cash returned about 0.6%, so on track to being just above 2%. It's no longer sort of paying you to leave all the money in cash. You want to get some of it invested, although cash still serves a purpose for liquidity and safety to some degree. So that was the cash return. The bond market, the Canadian Universe bond market, was up 2% in the quarter, bringing its year-to-date return to 2.2%. So it hadn't done much earlier in the year, but a 2% return on the bond market is a decent return, and that provided some stability for portfolios as well. Equities were all positive for some of those reasons we talked about before: earnings holding up, AI investment holding up, growth being resilient, even though it's slowing a little bit. And you can see that across geographies. So the Canadian market, which is in the middle there, was up 7% in the quarter, 11.2 year to date. And then that huge return for the 1 year, which included gold's return last year and energy earlier in the year. The US market was up 17% with a resurgence of the IT stocks in the second quarter, as well as an increase in the US dollar versus the Canadian dollar, because this is all in Canadian dollar terms. So the US dollar was up about 4.5% in Canadian dollar terms, which helped to contribute to that growth in the US equity. International developed markets up about 12.9% in the quarter, and then emerging markets up 26.2 with a very big return for the 1 year. And that's a continued contribution in the emerging markets from the semiconductor firms and some of the AI theme playing through there. So if we combine all of that into our balanced benchmark, which is a combination of, about 40% bonds and then a balanced geographic contribution of stocks, a balanced portfolio would be up 6.8% in the quarter, 7.8% year to date, and 17% for the 1 year period. So strong contribution from the equities again this year, but bonds also holding their own, this quarter rather, bonds also holding their own. The next slide looks a little bit at the contribution by sector, which is interesting this quarter because we talk a lot about how narrow leadership can be from certain companies, but in fact, there was a fairly broad contribution across sectors in the last quarter. So technology, of course, still very strong, 31% return in the quarter, so driving a lot of return there. But then if you look, industrials were up 14.9%, real estate was up, consumer discretionary was up, financials were up, healthcare was up. So a lot of the sectors across the S&P 500 had positive returns. There was a broadening out towards the end of the quarter. The one negative contributor that we saw was energy, which had, of course, been very strong in the beginning of the year with the Middle East conflict heating up and had come off a little bit in the second quarter. And you can see that negative 13% return in energy. But beyond that, that sector, most of the sectors had positive returns in the quarter. So we'll talk just briefly on the next slide about fixed income markets. We don't always spend a lot of time working on this or talking about this. We've tended to be a little bit at the lower end of our fixed income range and the higher end of our equity range in constructing portfolios within the strategic asset mixes that we have. But if you look here, we're talking about the fact that there are some higher yields on bonds now. Bonds are returning up to 4.4% on 10-year bonds from governments. So we're getting positive returns on bonds that is providing some income to the portfolios. So where people were not feeling they were getting returns before, now holding bonds can provide income to the portfolio, and that can be positive. We do still want to watch duration, though, because with this fear that we'll talk about in a second about inflation that could resurface as we continue to have these supply side shocks, if inflation does go higher and if interest rates follow higher, that could impact returns on fixed income. So we want to keep an eye on duration and probably stay shorter duration, but still be satisfied that we can get some income on bonds. On the right-hand side here, we talk a little bit about the spreads. Spreads are quite tight. So because the market is not pricing in a lot of bond defaults, the general consensus is that corporate fundamentals are still healthy. Therefore, you're not getting a lot more return for adding more risk in the portfolio. So our feeling in terms of fixed income is that it can make sense in the portfolio instead of having quite so much cash if your needs are a little bit longer term. You can hold to get some good income, but probably keep a little bit lower duration so you don't have the interest rate risk, and certainly think about matching to your income needs. And then, you can stay in pretty high quality bonds, whether it's government or high investment grade bonds. You don't need to go out further to get higher returns. The next slide talks a little bit about the stock market again. One question we get asked a lot is, are stocks becoming too expensive? I mean, they are expensive, but valuations are high, we know. This does support that valuations remain elevated. So you can see the S&P 500, which is trading at 20.4 times forward earnings, which is above its long 30-year average. So things are still expensive. The top companies still represent a high level of earnings, and there's still narrow leadership. There was a number of companies that were reporting today, so it'll be interesting to see. I think Apple, Amazon, Meta, a number of companies that are coming out with earnings today. So there is a high valuation in the stock market. However, there is some support to that for two reasons. One, that earnings are holding up, so they're not sort of falling back. People aren't as worried about that. But also the fact that AI promises increases to productivity, which could be a reason that multiples are a little bit higher. So I think valuations shouldn't scare you away from investing at all, but you want to be careful about the valuations and not only be in the most expensive parts of the market. The next slide is talking a little bit about just general growth in the market. So we have seen, as we talked about in those polling questions, global growth has remained resilient. It is slowing a little bit, but it's not breaking. So you can see the global composite growth number is still in expansionary territory above 50. So it's at 51.3, with manufacturing growing a little bit stronger than service sectors. So that continues to grow. And then one thing we have seen is where often, especially in the US market, consumption really drives economic growth. Now you're seeing investment, the CapEx investment in AI and fiscal investment are really replacing to some degree the consumer. So the economy continues to grow, but it's driven a little bit more by structural investment than just by consumption. But generally a positive, if slower, global growth story. And then we talk a little bit about what's happening with the Fed. And it'll be interesting to see, there's an announcement at 2 p.m. today, the next announcement on interest rates. I think people are believing the Fed will hold constant on interest rates, but there's some thought that there could be some hikes coming forward. So this is really talking about where the Fed has come from. And we'll remember we've talked in prior sessions about the dual mandate the Fed has. They're trying to make sure we have full employment, and they're also trying to manage prices. So to have more employment, you'd want to reduce rates to incent the economy. But if it gets too hot, you want to raise rates to reduce inflation. So the old Fed era would have been to focus primarily on employment first, and as employment labor numbers are getting a little softer, you'd want to cut rates to incent the economy. And that was all in the backdrop of expecting inflation to normalize. But because we've had these supply shocks driven by geopolitical events, the inflation has stayed a bit higher, and we're now looking a little bit more at an era where the Fed is focused a little bit more on inflation first. And there is a possibility that there could be a raise in rates at some point. I mean, the market in some ways is pricing in even maybe 2 quarter-point hikes in the year, which I think might be higher than we'll see. But there is, it's making it a bit harder for central banks to decide what to do. I think in Canada, most people feel Canada will hold rates steady at 2.25% through the end of the year. But there is some thought that the Fed in the US might raise in spite of political pressure to do the opposite. If that happens, we'll have to keep an eye on currencies and the impact on the US dollar versus Canada. But at the moment, Canada is holding, and I think it's probably likely the Fed will hold at 2 o'clock, but we'll wait and see that announcement. So we've got a couple of slides that focus a little bit on what's supporting each of the economies and the markets. So to get a sense of where do we think the supports are that are driving continued growth in the markets and the economies. So for Canada, we still have energy that's a stabilizing export base, and that is, under more demand. We're looking at pipeline capacity and expanding that, which is helping the Canadian economy. We've also seen some broader momentum across industries, and the public investment, the fiscal investment made by the government is positive. I think housing is pretty uneven, but the rest of these, including energy and public spending, are supporting the Canadian economy, and that is helping to see some broader activity across sectors and industries. If we look at the US next, the US is a little bit more focused on AI infrastructure. So a lot more of that AI investment and spending is happening there, and that's really driving the economy in the US. The consumer, which is a very big part of the US economy, is continuing to hold up. So there is some softening of sentiment among individuals, but the consumer is still spending. So even though they've moderated a bit, they're still spending. That's supporting things. The government spending is continuing in industrial policy and defense and other areas. And while we see some cooling in the labor markets, it's not breaking. So the US economy is remaining resilient, even though the Fed is not cutting rates. So we have these drivers that are still supporting the US market. Of course, the US market is more expensive in terms of valuation. So we want to watch that when we look at building portfolios. The next slide looks at the rest of the world, and you can see here we have some recovery in Europe on the manufacturing side. We have some benefit from the build out of the AI supply chain in emerging markets in Korea, for example. And we have fiscal and defense spending in Europe supporting. So there's some policy support, even the central banks there potentially looking at rate cuts or have had rate cuts that can help support the economies. So we have a number of engines that are working to support things, even though we have risks, and that's generally providing a positive backdrop still for the economies. So if we go to the next one, AI, as Lauren said, we can't talk about markets and economies without talking about AI at this time. So I think there's a couple of stories. So first of all, there was the big focus on infrastructure, that build out of data centers and build out of the hyperscalers and the CapEx that's happened. A lot of that has been priced into the markets, and we've seen that benefit in the semiconductor companies like NVIDIA and others. The other side of what we're looking at is sort of where does it go beyond that? And you look at the productivity story. So what areas, what companies and sectors are going to benefit from the use of AI and becoming more productive? And so you really want to focus on, industries and businesses that are very heavily process driven, and those processes can be automated to make those businesses more productive and to cut costs potentially. So that's sort of the next stage, which that is what the market is looking at a lot now. Some people are saying, we've spent all this money on CapEx. Are we getting the productivity that we need? And that's impacting a little bit of what we're seeing in the markets in this month, where you see a little bit of volatility or fragility in some of those names. So there's two sides of that. I think beyond those big mega caps, we're looking at, the hardware supply, but also those companies that will benefit from a productivity point of view. And that's, I think, really what managers are looking at now is how can we find those companies that are using AI to become much more productive, and how does that create the benefit for those companies potentially having a higher multiple on their price in terms of valuations. So we can't forget the next slide, which is that trade uncertainty. This gets into some uncertainties here. So trade uncertainty is still there. We had been hoping that CUSMA or the USMCA, whichever way you say it, would be resolved at this point. So the agreement remains in place, but there's not an extension to it. So there's an annual review period being instigated, and that creates some uncertainty around that agreement. At the same time, over the past week, the U.S. administration has announced higher tariffs. So these Section 338 tariffs on which are 50% duty on about 5% of Canadian imports, and then the broader Section 301 duties that apply to a lot of countries, apparently based on labor practices, which seems, I think, odd based on Canadian law, but those announcements have been made. We still will have to wait and see how they roll out. They're not enough to completely derail things, but it does add uncertainty. So I think with some of these things, we have uncertainty across the trade sectors, which will have an impact on company decision making. And there also can be some impact on regional differences in Canada. So, Saskatchewan and Alberta will be less impacted by these tariffs than the other provinces. And so you'll want to make sure that Canada continues to have unity in terms of the provincial leadership as we choose the best paths forward. So this is a source of uncertainty going forward. The next slide talks about geopolitics, which is a continued source of uncertainty. We still see conflict, heating up again in the Middle East as of last night and this morning. So that there's still potential for a critical choke point in energy there. And then Ukraine, Russia continuing to have this conflict that makes it difficult for those economies, and that could impact energy and exports as well. So this is potential for greater continuation of supply disruptions. So both of those things, as well as some other risks we have on the next slide, will impact the way we look at portfolios. So numbers 1 and 6 sort of relate to that geopolitical and supply shock areas, but other things we'll be watching for is there going to be a shift in how central banks make decisions? Is there going to be any slowdown in AI capital spending? We don't see it yet, but that's something we want to keep an eye on. Will there be any deterioration in labor markets or credit stress? So these are some things we need to watch. I guess bringing these all together, you've got, a number of relatively positive things. Each economy is sort of supported by fiscal policy, by consumer hanging in there, by earnings, by AI spending. So those are positives. There are some risks therefore also though that we need to watch out for. So therefore you need to think about how you're going to manage a portfolio in this backdrop. So the next slide sort of speaks to that a little bit. If we want to look at how we invest through uncertainty. So with this uncertain backdrop, which, again, a bunch of positive things, but some uncertainties, we want to have quality in the portfolio. We want to invest in companies with strong balance sheets in case some of those uncertainties create risks. We want to be careful with duration. So in terms of fixed income, we want to stay relatively short, not to be impacted by interest rate and inflation risk. We also want to match our liquidity to what we need. So if we know we're going to need money in the short term, from the portfolio, we want to keep some liquidity for that purpose so we don't have to sell out at the wrong time if there is a pullback due to valuations or if there is a pullback due to some of those uncertainties we talked about. So high valuations don't mean we want to get rid of equity. We actually still think that we can get paid well for owning good stocks, but we want to have a focus on quality, diversification, and being disciplined in how we construct portfolios. So there's only 2 more slides here. The next one talks about how to look at equities. With this, we want to be diversified and continue to own stocks not only in the US, but have global diversification where we've got some stocks that are still better priced. With the US, we want to maintain some exposure to the high quality technology leaders, but we also want to be careful on valuation and think about other sectors that aren't quite so expensive. And then we want to participate in this structural investment in AI, but we also want to be diversified across other areas. And finally, when we look at other parts of the portfolio, we want to have high quality in our fixed income. We don't think we need to go out to a high risk area to get paid more. We want to have good quality there. We may want to look at having some real asset protection for the long term that could involve some exposure to gold and precious metals. You get that partially by investing in the Canadian index anyways. And then diversification is really an important area. We want to make sure we've got a combination of asset classes and stocks across different sectors and geographies and different types of sectors that we're investing in. So that diversification theme is one that Frank's going to be talking a little bit more about in his remarks. So I'll pass things over to Frank and I'll see you again in the question and answer section. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. We'll kick off the presentation with a skill testing question that ties into our discussion today. So what stock was the largest contributor to global equity market returns, and we use the MSCI ACWI index as a proxy in the first half of 2026? Was it A, NVIDIA, B, Micron, C, Alphabet, or D, Taiwan Semiconductors? So all large companies, some of these companies are household names or have become household names recently. I'm curious to see what our audience thinks of who has contributed the greatest to the strong returns that we saw in the first half of 2026. So we'll wait for responses from our audience and gauge that from see what people think. All right. So Alphabet got no votes, but the overwhelming votes went into NVIDIA at 39%, followed by Micron and Taiwan Semiconductor at 30%. So if we move to the following slide, we'll kind of get a glimpse into the answer to the question. So Micron was the single largest contributor to global equity returns in the first half of 2026. The shares were up an astonishing 291% in the first half of the year and contributed a little over 1% of the 11.5% return generated by the MSCI ACWI index. This chart outlines the leading contributors and is pretty revealing how technology hardware names were the dominant winners in the first half. Only Caterpillar, the manufacturer's construction equipment, made the top 10 contribution list. What's interesting is that the largest contributions did not come from the largest constituents like NVIDIA or Alphabet, but from large to mid-sized companies that saw pretty massive gains, such as SK Hynix that rose by 300%. Which brings us to our themes today. So equity markets have been delivering exceptional returns over the last number of years. And as we've noted, a lot of the gains have come from technology stocks, mostly in the US and emerging markets. Observing the mountain of capital being directed to building AI capacity, the inclination for some would be to lean into this theme and either add to equity portfolio allocations or perhaps consolidate equity exposures to the companies that are the direct beneficiaries of the AI theme. The message we want to highlight today is that investors should stay the course and remain disciplined in respecting strategic portfolio allocations and ensure equity portfolios are diversified and not overly concentrated to a single geography, sector, or investment theme. This means that if a portfolio allocation has grown to above one's risk tolerance levels, then it might be prudent to seriously consider rebalancing options. Similarly, though we believe the AI theme is a powerful force that is providing investors with attractive investment opportunities, they should also consider the longer-term benefits of maintaining diversity within equity allocations. We'll highlight 4 observations on equity markets to support this argument. First, we'll touch on the unusually high dispersion we've experienced in equity markets. Second, we'll look at the strong earnings growth supporting markets today and the bold growth expectations going forward. Third, we'll highlight how we've experienced a regime shift in equity markets with falling correlations between different regions. And lastly, we'll touch on Japanese equities that have quietly outperformed recently and why investors should start to take notice. Our first topic relates to the unusual return dispersion we're experiencing in global equity markets since the start of the year. When we refer to return dispersion of an equity index, it relates to when price action of individual stocks within an index are moving in drastically different directions. It's totally normal to have stock prices oscillate in reaction to market headlines. But we've noted that the level of return dispersion was more than 2 times the long-term average in the second quarter. These charts are from a research paper published by Acadian Asset Management that show the monthly return dispersion for the MSCI ACWI index that it's averaged 7.6% over the last 30 years. In May of this past year, dispersion levels hit 15.6%, indicating that certain stocks like Micron and SK Hynix were realizing massive gains, whereas other stocks were experiencing huge drawdowns. Note that global equity markets have experienced similar levels of elevated dispersion, such as the early 2000s at the apex of the tech bubble, and equity markets subsequently experienced a material drawdown. Now, we're not implying that this will happen again this time around. However, it is somewhat concerning that there's such drastic moves in stock valuations. What we want to point out is that with high dispersion, it's masking the return drivers for broad market indices. Though equity markets are steadily moving higher, beneath the surface, there's a great deal of individual stock volatility. A concentrated number of stocks that are smaller in size are experiencing some extreme gains that is masking the weakness in larger stocks in the index. Much of this is attributed to investor excitement about everything tied to AI. While it's normal to see small cap stocks rise by 50 or 100% in a single month, it's quite unusual to see larger companies experience even larger gains. A prime example is chipmaker Intel, that saw its share price triple in value within a 6-week period in the second quarter. The next slide provides a glimpse of this widening dispersion in equity markets. This chart compares the return profile for hardware versus software companies in the S&P 500 over the last 12 months. Over the last decade, the correlation between the two indices was 93%, meaning that the share prices of hardware and software companies nearly mirrored each other. However, since 2025, correlation is negative 27, as we've seen valuations for chip, memory, and other hardware companies rise in value, while software companies have experienced valuation compression over investor fears on the disruptive impact from AI. The elevated return dispersion raises interesting questions for investors. First, are the extreme price gains and losses reflecting a deviation or a convergence to fundamental value? Now, time will tell, but investors should recognize that the risk of a reversal of these price moves is also rising. Second, the strong performance of equity markets and the media attention on the prospects tied to the AI theme are spurring animal spirits, and naturally, it's causing investor risk appetite to climb higher. At extreme levels, we're seeing this with capital formation in single stock levered ETFs. These products have attracted huge amounts of capital inflows from investors looking to earn 2 to 3 times the return of a single stock by using financial leverage and derivative products. Thirdly, we're noting that many active managers are materially underperforming global equity benchmarks. This is partially due to the extreme return dispersion. How managers react to this development will be interesting, as there's pressures to capture the spoils of the AI built-out from investors. It's important for investors to understand these dynamics to appreciate their investment risks and how portfolio positioning will have on future returns. The next observation is on equity markets and the optimistic earnings growth profile. This slide shows that annual earnings per share for the S&P 500 over the last quarter century. On average, the growth rate is just shy of 8%. Now, the build-out of the AI ecosystem was a key driver for the 10% and the 13% growth in earnings in 2024 and 25. And analysts are calling for earnings to now grow 2 to 3 times the long-term average out to 2028. Though companies have shown a pattern of exceeding growth expectations over the last 2 years, the elevated growth estimates do warrant some scrutiny from our perspective. The next slide illustrates this point. Note that since the start of 2026, earnings growth has accelerated for the S&P 500. A great deal of that heavy lifting has come from the Magnificent Seven. Therefore, a lot of the growth has been centered on the hyperscalers that have benefited from ever-growing AI capital spending, as well as higher valuations for private investments they hold in the likes of OpenAI, Anthropic, and SpaceX, that are being marked higher and are reflected in higher earnings. The next slide highlights the earnings growth across different sectors. Important that earnings growth is broad-based, which is very encouraging. However, investors need to be mindful that to sustain double-digit earnings growth, we will likely need to see ongoing strong contributions from the technology sector and rising contributions from companies in the financial, industrial, and healthcare sectors that are capable of using AI, robotics, and other technologies to realize significant productivity gains that will trigger another lever for earnings growth. There is a risk that any slowdown in AI spending plans or delays in the timelines for companies to reap the benefits from AI investments may result in a more moderate earnings growth. As a consequence, this may dampen investor sentiment and weigh on valuations, particularly on the stocks that have an embedded growth expectations related to AI investments. Our third observation is on equity markets as it relates to fading cross-regional correlations. For many years, regional equity markets have moved in lockstep. This was because, for the most part, we had a great deal of synchronicity in ease policy from central banks. Globalization was on the rise, and there was near frictionless trade, and markets dealt with little geopolitical risk. As the chart shows, correlations between the S&P 500 and both domestic and international markets was over 80% between 2015 and 2021. The pandemic and geopolitical conflicts shortly after have triggered a regime shift in regional correlations, and we've seen a material decoupling in correlations since 2025. We attribute this change to structural shifts in financial markets. Central banks are moving in different directions. While the Bank of Japan is increasing interest rates, the Bank of China is cutting or holding rates at historical low levels. And the US Fed is now leaning to potentially increasing interest rates. This is creating a great deal of volatility in currency markets. More importantly, geopolitical and trade tensions are now reversing the benefits companies gain from globalization. This is disrupting supply chains, trade activity, and forcing governments to intervene to support domestic industries. The decoupling of regional market correlations reinforces the opportunities that come from maintaining a diversified portfolio, as the fundamental earnings drivers for regional markets looks drastically different than it did 15 to 20 years ago. This table highlights this dynamic. Today, the US is dominated by mega cap technology companies, with many benefiting from AI infrastructure spending boom. Canada, on the other hand, remains a resource powerhouse, with excellent exposure to leading commodity producers. Europe and Japan have a great deal of depth of companies in the industrial sector, with Japan home to many tech leaders in robotics. We see this divergence in correlation as a sign to avoid the impulse to concentrate portfolios into areas that have performed well recently that include US technology, and revisiting opportunities both domestically and internationally where other themes are creating renewed potentials. For our final observation on equity markets, we want to expand on the potential attractive opportunities outside the US. After decades of subpar returns, Japanese equities have experienced somewhat of a rebirth in recent years and generated some pretty impressive returns. This chart compares the historical returns of the MSCI Japan Index to both the S&P 500 and the MSCI ACWI Index. Over the last year, Japan's 29.5% return has outperformed the S&P 500 at 21% and the ACWI Index at 24%. If you look at 3-year returns, they're almost identical. Now, how have Japanese companies that have struggled for years after the asset bubble burst in the late 1980s make such huge strides to outpace the mighty S&P 500? We will touch on the details shortly, but a lot has to do with earnings growth, which, much like the US markets, is rooted in strong fundamental results from its companies. The next slide illustrates this point. The chart compares the earnings per share trend over the last decade between the S&P 500, which has been a top performer thanks to the Magnificent Seven, and the MSCI Japan in yen. While the S&P 500 has had growth early on, we've seen some strong growth more recently from Japan, with both regions generating 9% annual compound growth rates in earnings. While growth from the Mag 7 and the AI theme have been key drivers in the US, contributions to Japan have been from different sources. Well over a decade ago, policymakers and regulators set out to address the chronic weakness in Japan's economic and corporate ecosystems. Japanese companies were struggling with low profitability, inefficient balance sheets, and almost no accountability to shareholders. All this resulted in having to deal with excess leverage that required balance sheet repair for most of the 1990s. The initiatives to spark a change came from proxy advisors, the Tokyo Stock Exchange, and the Japanese government. In fact, the Tokyo Stock Exchange used the term Ishiki Kaikuku in their official action plans to describe of moving management away from passive box-ticking compliance towards genuine self-motivated capital efficiency. While it did not occur overnight, Japanese companies have been actively meeting this challenge. They've raised prices, cut costs, they've sold assets, and they've returned cash to shareholders via share buybacks. This has been the driver for the impressive growth in earnings. Moving on to our final slide, we believe that despite the strong recent returns, Japan could be an attractive allocation for equity investors. First, we think the benefits from Ishiki Kaikuku will continue to accrue and provide strong tailwinds for active investors that can identify the companies taking proactive steps. Second, though valuations have increased at 17 times forward earnings, Japanese equities are trading at reasonable levels compared to the US at 20. Third, we suspect that Japan has not yet attracted enough believers. We come to this conclusion when we look at 203 active strategies on the investment database platform that suggests that 74% of these strategies are underweight Japan. So we think that there's room for global investors to come to appreciate the appeal of owning Japanese companies, and there's upside to the valuations. This is the end of my presentation. We hope our discussion has on maintaining risk-adjusted equity portfolios, allocations within portfolios has resonated with you. I'll now pass it back to Lauren for questions.
Thank you, Frank and Krista, so much for your timely insights and wisdom. I will jump straight into the Q&A. First question touches on two of this year's favorite topics, AI and elevated valuations. So the question is, many investors feel they've missed some opportunity in AI because they don't own a concentrated allocation to the Magnificent Seven. Where do you see the most compelling opportunities for investors beyond these headline-grabbing names?
Maybe I'll start on that and then you can jump in, Frank. I think, because we talked about certain things already being priced in, some of the trends, some of the extra CapEx being priced in, I don't think it's too late to still look at how AI can benefit your portfolio, but it may not be from those traditional sources. They're well-run companies and they may continue to do well, but they are expensive. So it still makes sense to have some in your portfolio. I don't think you want to only invest in those. But where I think the real hunt is in looking for the companies that are going to use AI most effectively to become more productive, to automate their processes, and to therefore increase their own profitability. And I think that's something that our managers are looking for. But as we were talking about before internally, if you're looking for companies that are very process driven, so potentially the financial companies, the banks, the insurance companies, those companies have a lot of repetitive processes, and if they can use and harness AI well, that can help to automate their business and to create more productivity. And I think maybe we talked a little bit about healthcare too, is another area that people are looking at this for. So I think it's sort of what are the next order of businesses that are really going to benefit from using this technology. And that remains to be seen. I mean, there's a lot of spending going on for the promise of this productivity, and it's hard to know exactly where it's coming from. But we were talking internally before. I think the managers are now putting that into their selection criteria when they're looking at companies. So one of the things you're looking at is, balance sheet stability and management team, but also how are those companies planning on or using AI already to become more efficient. So I don't think it's too late for the trend. I think it's, yes, there's not just one way to play it. Some parts may be priced into the market, but still be good companies, but there are other types of things to look for. So I don't know, Frank, if you want to add, I stole some of the comments we were talking about internally, but maybe you want to see if there's anything else.
I think there's companies across different sectors. So financials is one example, but also, if you think about technology and software companies that can basically integrate some of the tools from AI to kind of make their offering more attractive, and maintain pricing power, those companies are going to be beneficiaries. They haven't really reaped the benefits, as I highlighted. They've seen their values compress recently, but ultimately they could be a winner down the road if they're able to kind of reap the benefits from AI. And it's different. We're really relying on our sub advisors, kind of doing all the hard work to identify the companies, and obviously large workforces behind companies, a lot of process driven work that can be automated with AI. Those are opportunities. So I think there's different ways to kind of remain invested in this theme.
Thank you both. Our next question takes us to Japan. As Frank highlighted, a market that's attracted a lot of attention lately. The question is, you highlighted Japanese equities as an attractive opportunity today. How are you reflecting that opportunity in your portfolios?
I think from a high level perspective, when we look at our portfolios, we've maintained an allocation to international markets for a period of time. We have not deviated from that stance. We think there's opportunities there, so we maintain that allocation. And we've noted in conversations with our sub advisors that they are doing more work on Japan, looking at the benefits from some of the companies. So we're seeing that at the margin. They represent a larger part of the portfolios through selective work from individual managers. So from our perspective, we're happy to see that some of the managers that I would say were less open to the idea are seeing the benefits from some of the work that started a decade ago from regulators and the like in Japan that are providing opportunities. So that's how we're seeing it. We're seeing from managers being far more open to investing in that country than they have, I would say, historically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I would say, like, I think that on the bigger picture for most portfolios, the idea that we're not just sticking to North America or to US, we're also including international allocations with managers that are looking at Japan is the primary way. There are a few clients who have the right risk appetite who want us to have thematic exposure in their portfolio. So we may have a little bucket within the portfolio that allows us to invest in certain themes. And so there are selective portfolios where we do have a Japanese ETF that we've included, and that's only if it fits into your risk tolerance and it complements the other pieces in the portfolio. So there's sort of a broader way, but also potentially a thematic exposure if it makes sense for the client.
Thank you both. Moving now to a geopolitical question that brings us south of the border. What is your outlook on the level of volatility Trump will generate with the midterm elections? And is that a longer term concern? I suppose just the long-term impact from the Trump administration.
Yeah, complicated question. I think, often people see as you get closer to a midterm that you want to have more stability in your economy and your markets because that helps the incumbent government to manage the election process. That doesn't seem to really be happening when we have new announcements about trade disruption and ongoing conflicts that I think the administration would prefer to have resolved. So I think there is volatility built into how this administration makes decisions. They put things forward and then they change their mind, et cetera. So there's some volatility in there. I think we're trying to sort of stay above that noise and really focus on the fundamentals in a portfolio, have those good quality companies, have a portfolio mix that makes sense for you. Don't worry so much about the ups and downs. You have to be aware of that and you have to live through that. But I think try to really build, quality, safe, diversified portfolios and not be quite so concerned about the short-term fluctuations, which I think there will continue to be some, given the way decisions are made down there. I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that, Frank, but
And obviously, one of my points is that there has been a structural shift in markets geopolitically, and I think the midterms will be another signpost of that, and I have no foresight in terms of what the results will be, but it remains important to kind of remain diversified. US is obviously a big part of portfolios because it's just the opportunity set is so significant, but there's reason to kind of look at other areas. So I'm more focused on the high level points of maintaining good exposures across markets and not be too fickle on certain events like the midterms in November.
I think there was that slide in the presentation that I had that was talking about investing through uncertainty, that this will be a cause of additional uncertainty, and there has been a lot lately. But part of that is to focus on quality, focus on diversification, hold companies that you think are going to do well longer term based on this, the structural factors that we're looking at in the economy. And yeah, don't be so fussed by that, but be prepared that we may have continued volatility this year, partially because markets are priced high, so any little adjustments cause some fluctuations, and markets have done well, so you could see some pullback. All of that is normal in the course of managing portfolios. So stick with your portfolio strategy, talk to your advisor if you get nervous about things, but try to stick with that strategy and be comforted by having good quality securities and a good portfolio construction that ties to your objectives.
Thank you, Krista and Frank. I will answer this next question. It's a technical question about the webinar recording. And yes, we will circulate a recording of this webinar to participants by the end of the week. Last question. I think maybe we have time for one or two more. So maybe last question is about bonds. Another topic that after being in the wilderness for many years is attracting attention. The question is, investors have been comfortable holding elevated cash balances in recent years. With cash rates likely past their peak and bond yields being attractive, do you see an opportunity to reduce or, I guess, underweight cash and increase exposure to bonds?
Yeah, I mean, you saw that the cash returns are going down. If they were 0.6 last quarter and bond returns were 2% last quarter, there's a little bit of a shift. For a while, it was very easy to say it doesn't matter, stay a little bit with extra cash in your portfolio because you were getting paid for it after many years of getting zero. So there was a shift for a little bit of time there. I think what we would look at now is really what's the need for liquidity in the portfolio. If you have a short-term need, then still have cash to match it because that's going to be the best match and the best safety and security for you. But if you're trying to balance some equity risk by having some non-equities, then bonds are now paying you some income to stay in them. So I think our strategic positioning is we still tend to be a little bit higher in our equity weight and a little bit lower in our bond weight. But you can have good bonds that you can hold to provide income to the portfolio as a ballast to your equity movement. And if your income needs or your liquidity needs are a little bit further along, so you don't need the cash in the next little while and you don't need it all to be sitting in cash, then bonds can now give you that income that you're not getting from the cash part of the portfolio. So I think a little bit of an answer around that, I guess. I mean, we're not going to zero cash in all bonds because I think then you do have some interest rate risk in there. But I think you can, have cash to meet your objectives and then have a little bit more, some in the bond area to earn some income and balance your equity exposure.
Thank you, Krista.
Mm-hmm.
We answered everything. Okay, so that brings us to the end of today's session. I hope you found it valuable, and we hope you have a great rest of your afternoon, and we hope we see you next quarter. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.